coming out on this cold day, not too unlike the day 150 years ago that we're commemorating, except there should be more wind and more cotton, more whiskey. That was a joke. Anyways, if you can have any levity for an event this serious. I'm Eric Emerson. I'm director of the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. I'm also chair of South Carolina's Civil War Sesquicentennial Advisory Board. This one? Great. All right. Wonderful. Good. So no one missed my bad jokes. Okay. I'm Eric Emerson. I'm director of the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. I'm also chair of the State Civil War Sesquicentennial Advisory Board. We're here today to commemorate a very traumatic event in the history of Columbia, which was really a culmination of a number of days of traumatic events for the state of South Carolina. Part of our mission is to establish a marker program as it was established in 1905. Since 1905, we've produced 1,560 state markers. 29 of those markers deal with the Civil War in Richland County. As we looked at markers in preparation for the commemoration, a glaring omission from that list of markers was actually a marker to mark the burning of Columbia. And so we set about to remedy that. I think we've done that quite effectively. I want to thank the coordinator of our state marker program, Ehren Foley, who you'll hear from in a few minutes. This is a particularly tricky marker to produce based upon the varying accounts of events of the nights of February 17th, 1865. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ehren Foley.
All right, thank you, Dr. Emerson. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. I want to talk about the process of remembering, sort of the thing that we are doing here today. Because I think it's an important thing to reflect upon how and why we remember the past. It's a reminder that the past is not merely a chronicle of all the events that came before this moment, but rather is about telling and retelling the stories about the past that we perform in the ever-changing present. As William Faulkner wrote in Requiem for a Nun, the past is never dead. It's not even past. And that sentiment is perhaps nowhere more evident than in the case of Civil War memory, and especially an event such as the burning of Columbia in February of 1865. Which then leads to the obvious question, and one that I've been asked a few times when I mentioned that we were dedicating a burning of Columbia marker, which is, there's not a burning of Columbia marker? There's a simple answer that I've kind of made jokingly, or maybe half jokingly, and that's to say that the event is burned so indelibly in the collective memory of the city that no marker was needed. And maybe if there had been a marker, it would say simply Sherman was here, or something to that effect. But there's more, really. There's a better answer than that, frankly. And that's to say that, in fact, there are many markers to the burning of Columbia, and they're all around us right now and right here today. There have been many attempts over the years to remember, to commemorate, to mark on the landscape this moment. The attempt to remember the conflagration began almost before the burning embers had cooled. In March of 1865, the noted South Carolina author William Gilmore Simms serialized the description of events in the newly established Columbia Phoenix newspaper, and the columns were later collected and published in pamphlet form as the sack and destruction of the city of Columbia. Simms, who had been in Columbia on the night of the fire, had little doubt about what had occurred or who was responsible. "We have seen with surprise," he wrote, "some attempts to account for the destruction of Columbia by ascribing it to accident, to the drunkenness of straggling parties, to our Negroes, and indeed to any but the proper cause, which for Simms was the cold, calculated, and premeditated plans of the Army of the Tennessee and its commanders." It is interesting to note, however, that implicit within Simms's statement of certainty there exists evidence of doubt. Simms was self-consciously writing to refute accounts that offered a counter-narrative. to the Sherman burned it version of events that Sims was providing to his readers. Sims's narrative was history as melodrama, stocked with heroes and villains, and not surprisingly, the line between the two was mostly, though not entirely, traced along the Mason-Dixon. Public memory of the events of February 1865 would largely follow the contours of Sims's writings for the next 100 or more years, and early attempts to erect physical markers commemorating the burning would take up the torch where Sims had left it. On February 17, 1914, the Wade-Hampton chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy placed a 7-foot-tall, 4-foot-wide boulder of Richland granite just north of the city in the middle of what is now the Earlwood neighborhood, marking the location where Mayor T.J. Goodwin surrendered the town to William Tecumseh Sherman. Descendants of the mayor and aldermen who had surrendered the city were present that day. The aptly named mayor of the city in 1914, Wade Hampton Gibbs, grandson of Robert Wilson Gibbs, whose home had been destroyed by Union soldiers the night of the fire, offered some comment. Like Sims a half-century before, Gibbs had little doubt as to where to place blame. Contemporary local evidence is not needed to fix and brand the criminals who were guilty of the arson of our city, he told the crowd. The antecedent and subsequent incendiarism in the track of Sherman's army are not needed to fix the crime of vandalism upon William Tecumseh Sherman. Of course, the whole event was meant to highlight the perfidy of Union soldiers who burned an undefended and already surrendered city, to contrast Southern honor with Northern dishonor. Mrs. Clark Waring, president of the Wade-Hampton chapter, made the point explicit in her remarks, noting first that it is not often the case that the losing side in the grim game of war seeks to rescue from oblivion the spot where they encountered disaster and defeat, and continuing that the purpose was to remind all passers-by that the glory of the battle is not all in its success, that here it was that we lost all save honor and the grit which can bear all losses except honor. It was a message fitting with the dominant public memory of the Civil War in Columbia of that day, and one that was unalloyed by some of the reconciliationist sentiment that you may have found elsewhere in the country. No, here in Columbia, the story remained one that continued to explain Southern defeat in terms of treachery, superior numbers, and warfare that knew no limits, and countenanced even war against civilians. And the memory and the attempts to commemorate it would continue. Walk across the street. The State House is a veritable playground of these monuments. You have the George Washington statue with his broken cane, and you look at the base, and there's a plaque that was put there in 1930 by the Secretary of the Historical Commission, A.S. Sally, and it reads simply, "During the occupation of Columbia by Sherman's army, February 17 to 19, 1865, soldiers brickbatted this statue and broke off the lower part of the walking cane." The cane, of course, has never been repaired, instead serving, much like the bronze stars on the western side of the State House, to mark the locations where Union artillery shells struck the still unfinished State House as indelible reminders of the violence perpetrated against the city. These markers serving as figurative scars, reminders of the wounds never quite healed, of past transgressions that were never forgiven, all very appropriate symbols for the public memory of this event as it has continued in the city. And the list of markers could certainly go on. There's a 17-foot Corinthian pillar outside First Presbyterian Church dedicated in 1921, which was originally meant for the State House but damaged in February 1865 and is now a Confederate monument. There was the 16-inch tall granite block on Myron's Hill just across the river, placed there also in 1930 to mark the site where Union batteries fired into Columbia. There's the granite marker also across the street on the State House grounds, put there in 1937, marking the site where the original State House stood before it was burned in February 1865, and there's a litany of others. Some marked officially, some only by local tradition, describing or explaining what Sherman burned and why. Most, if not all, of these markers were of a kind They enshrined a narrative of Columbia's burning that expressed little doubt about the perpetrators. Interestingly, though, scholarly treatments going back at least to James Ford Rhodes in 1902 took a different tone. In the 1970s, for example, we get a book about the burning that introduces some measure of uncertainty and nuance and doubt into this story. Published not coincidentally as the last American helicopters were leaving Vietnam, Marion Lucas's Sherman and the burning of Columbia might be distilled down to say that cotton, whiskey, and wind were the main perpetrators, that the burning of Columbia was a story about the fog of war and the destructiveness that comes when societies decide to make war. Though Lucas did certainly give plenty of attention to human actors as well, outlining failures on both sides that contributed to the blaze. More recently, accounts have focused more broadly on the march as a whole, rather than singling out a single day in the course of an entire campaign. They have focused on the Army, or on the evolution of military policy, or on gender and race relations, or on narratives and popular memory of the march since 1865. And certainly this more expansive view is necessary. And without that context, it really is impossible to understand any one moment in what was a much longer campaign and an even longer war. But precious little of this more recent research has found its way into the popular memory of the event. And even less of it is evident in the public commemoration on the landscape. And the reasons for that absence, I think, are manifold, but principal among them is the fact that nuance and complexity, uncertainty and contingency, while great fodder for historical monographs, are more difficult to express on a monument or a marker. Instead, monuments and markers tend to deceive us with their imposing stature and their air of permanence. They are projections in many ways of certainty. They are attempts, often self-conscious ones, to etch a certain version of the past onto the landscape, and in so doing, to make it seem as if that interpretation represents a natural or indelible truth. But the past is a moving target, and it is impossible to write for all time. The best we can hope for is to write for our own time, to understand the past in its own terms, certainly, but ultimately we can only view it darkly and through the lens of the present. And I think it's important to remember this, because it's easy to look back and ridicule past actors for how short-sighted, naive, or biased their attempts to understand the past were, and such critiques are certainly necessary, and we should interrogate and remain skeptical of the representation of history that is expressed through public commemoration. We should ask questions about who is doing the commemorating, why, when. We shouldn't, though, have so much hubris as to believe that our version of the past represents the final word, or that future generations of historians might not point out the many flaws in our own understanding. And this continual reinterpretation of the past does not do violence to history, but in fact is the very lifeblood and essence of the study of history. So, as we have our moment here today and unveil this historical marker in this attempt to commemorate this one moment on the landscape here for our own time, we should enjoy it and hope that we can have some small impact on how people walking down Main Street will remember this day in February 1865. But I hope we can also remember that the work of history goes on and that our words will hardly be the final ones to be spoken on this subject. So thank you very much again for coming out today and participating in this memory and this event that we're having today. Thank you.
Dr. Foley and I will be around afterwards if anybody from the press would like to take the cover off the marker. And John, you want to join us?